Welcome everyone to this Merri Creek webinar. I can see there's a few people still coming along, but terrific to see so many of you joining this webinar today. I need to let you all know that the webinar is being recorded. We've had a number of people who aren't able to attend today and asked us to record it. My name's Louisa Macmillan. I have the good fortune of working for the Merri Creek Management Committee, and I'll just be doing the preliminary introductions today. You'll be hearing from Bruce and Anne McGregor for about 45 minutes, and we'll then have half an hour of Q&A. Please use the chat function for your questions. I'll be going through those questions and trying to group them thematically. We hope we can address all your questions in the remaining time. If you find you haven't got access to the chat function, you can also send questions by email to admin@mcmc.org.au. My colleague Michael Longmore will monitor the admin emails for those questions. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of the land and the waters of the Merri. I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge the tens of thousands of years during which the Woiwurrung people cared for the land and waters of the Merri, and their continuing care and healing of this land. I'm here on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land. I think probably many attendees are, but some of you are on other lands. And I'd like us all to acknowledge the lands, the traditional lands on which we are placed today. And I'd like to acknowledge all the other First Nations people who've been caring for and healing this country of ours. And I'd also like to acknowledge any Wurundjeri Woiwurrung who are here attending this webinar, and any other First Nations people who are attending, and to thank you for your interest and care. And I think now that many more of you are here, I can see we've got 88 people present, just to thank all of you for the terrific interest that you've shown in this webinar. We'll now be crossing over to Anne and Bruce McGregor. I think you can see them on your screen. Anne, or the two of them have been involved for a long time in restoring Merri Creek. Anne is the Vice President of the Friends of Merri Creek, and she's the current President of the Merri Creek Management Committee, both really important and significant roles. And Bruce McGregor is a former Vice President and former Secretary of the Merri Creek Management Committee, and is a life member of the Friends of Merri Creek. So now I'd like to pass over to Anne and Bruce.
Thank you, Louisa, and thank you everybody for attending. It's really great to have such a response to a webinar and interest in a bit of the history of the creek, which we'll tell you in visual terms today. Now, if you'd said to us when we moved into Brunswick in 1976 that we would be caught up in a local creek restoration project for the next 45 years, we might not have believed you. But it has been a very rewarding experience, and we have learnt a lot and worked with great people, and of course seen much progress. But the journey continues. There's more work to be done. So our talk today will briefly run through some of the early history, early being the recent history really, in the 70s and 80s and 90s of the creek restoration. We're not going back into the time when the Wurundjeri people were looking after the creek, but talking about that and explaining very briefly the main organisations involved, showing you some before and after photos, pretty graphic images of what has changed, some of the issues that have been faced, issues in terms of nature restoration, but also planning and urban development issues, and then quickly some of the current and future challenges. So back to the 1970s, the early 1970s, and there were several small action groups focused around the Merri Creek in those days. And they initiated with the Public Interest Research Group, which was a group based at Monash University, I think, a study of the Merri Creek, its current issues and its potential, which was published as the Merri Creek Study in 1975, which was a pretty important document. It set a vision for the creek. It set out the issues, first of all, the many problems of how it had got to the point of degradation, but how it could be really important environmental asset. And it did motivate people to get active and work towards that vision. And in fact, you find it's still a good read today. It's pretty informative on what the creek was like in the 1970s, which is an interesting sort of benchmark or starting point. So there were a number of issues, challenges, obstacles that were being faced in the 1970s. Perhaps the big one then was the Freeway Reservation that ran right down the Merri Creek Valley from, well, Craigieburn down to Clifton Hill. It was an artefact of the freeway engineers of the 1960s or even the 1950s. They could see a waterway with some open space on it, and that'd be a great place to build a freeway. And so that was something that, you know, was pretty challenging to deal with. There was associated with the freeway proposal was the intention by then the Melbourne and Metropolitan Board of Works, which is now Melbourne Water, to concrete line the creek and straighten it, make it a bit more efficient as a drain, because that was what the creeks were seen as, main drains. So concreting was certainly a threat, but they could only afford to do that if the freeway was built with the associated budget to concrete line the creek. We have had big power lines, big transmission lines, and they're still along the creek, as you'd all be well aware, quite a constraint on planting and a bit of a blot on the landscape. Rubbish dumping was a big thing there. The creek was seen as a convenient place to just dump whatever you didn't want anymore, because it was such a neglected part of the suburbs. There was an awful lot of rubbish, from car bodies down to supermarket trolleys down to sheep's innards. We had private ownership, old titles of land that went right to the creek bank, and so it was impossible to walk along the creek bank in many places. The local councils had, well, long-standing practices that didn't help the creek in terms of environmental management. We need to go into those there. And we had the three largest state-level engineering bodies, the Country Roads Board, which is now Vic Roads, the MMBW, and the State Electricity Commission, who were associated with some of those threats I've mentioned already. So that the local residents had to deal with those fairly powerful agencies, and many private owners who tended to turn their back on the creek and not see it as an asset. Anyway, just to illustrate the concrete lining threat, this is Moonee Ponds Creek. In this photograph comes from a document written by the Chief Drainage Engineer of Melbourne Metropolitan Board of Works. It was about the aesthetic improving the aesthetics of concrete-lined drains, this document, in response to complaints by environmentalists of the time about concrete lining of Many Ponds Creek and Gardeners Creek, I think several others around Melbourne. He was looking at whether the aesthetics could be improved, and he concluded that the aesthetics of concrete-lined drains could be improved by additional expenditure on pigments and or surface finishes. But because of the additional cost, such treatments should only be considered where environmental considerations warrant. However, the question is raised as to whether the mass of the ratepayers is prepared to pay the cost of the additional aesthetic treatments of concrete channels when there is such a backlog of drainage works awaiting finance. So that was a sort of attitude to our creeks that was certainly a bit of an issue in the 1970s. He wasn't questioning concrete lining, that was obviously the way to go, but whether it was even worth making them a bit more attractive, probably not. Anyway, a community vision for the Merri Creek was developed in the 1970s, which has really stood the test of time, I think. A number of aspects of that: preserving a natural asset for community benefit, regenerating vegetation or revegetation, and restoring habitats for wildlife, providing for recreation, encouraging public participation in what was being done, introducing environmentally appropriate flood control rather than concrete lining or big concrete walls, establishing a Merri Metropolitan Park along the whole corridor. And this vision has been shared by local councils, by state governments, and even federal governments of different political backgrounds over the past 45 years, and those governments have been obviously essential in investing in this vision. I'll hand over to Bruce.
Yes, good to meet everybody today on the webinar. I'm going to talk about some of the local actions that were required, and we're going to base it on Brunswick mostly, not completely, mainly because we know more about it and it was more challenging, but similar issues were faced in all the municipalities. So in 1976, we helped form a group based with the Brunswick Community Group, a Merri Creek Action Group. There was a walk advertised in the local newspaper, which existed at the time, and the group prepared a draft plan for parts of the Brunswick frontage, about restoration, and we sought council's support. And there's a whole series of newspaper articles at the time indicating council strongly supported that sort of concept, but of course the freeway reservations were still there. There were other people also interested, as Anne talked about the PERG report and Environment Victoria at the time, which was called the Conservation Council of Victoria. They ran an Urban Creeks campaign for a short period, which was highlighting the problems that Anne alluded to before about concrete lining and so on. So I just want to paint the picture of how this has evolved, just so you can understand the broad sort of organisation from the community perspective. So the first group that came together was the Merri Creek Coordinating Committee, and that was in response to the Brunswick Merri Creek Action Group writing to Fitzroy Council and saying, come on, Fitzroy Council, call a meeting. We knew that there were very keen councillors in Fitzroy, and they did that. And that brought together the various community groups. I think over the course of their existence, over 30 groups were involved, a lot of local end of street type groups, the 8 municipal councils at the time, and some government departments also participated. But there were some limitations to what the coordinating committee could do. We couldn't employ staff, for example, and we knew that the revegetation needed to be given a big kick along. So with some management input and some grants to look at how we might manage this issue or these issues, we've evolved into the Friends of Merri Creek, which was the organisation where all the community groups came together. Some of these groups had been going for quite a long time, and the focus there was on planting activities and weeding and so on, the sorts of things you can see advertised today. and the more formal group, the Merri Creek Management Committee, and it now consists of the 6 councils and the Friends, various Friends representatives. Yes, and the main purpose of the management committee is to employ skilled staff that are focused on the things that are needed to be done. So, for example, a manager, which is Louisa at the moment, parkland restoration staff, water watch education staff, and so on, and to deal with planning. I mean, previously those sorts of things have been done by volunteers, and it's very difficult and it's complicated to do that, especially with many councils and government agencies being involved. So what we'll do now is just to look at a few activities that happened. And so in terms of trying to transform the degraded Merri, here's some shots in Brunswick. This is one of our early plantings near the velodrome. It's very difficult there. The soil's been already interfered with. So you can see the planting here with these big stakes, and they were just removed. People came and took them. You can see it's in the open area and very difficult. This is a view looking up towards Moreland Road, which you can see here. And
you tell the story of putting your...
Oh, in this area here near Clara Street, when we did a planting here, and in fact you can see some of the trees that remain. I remember putting a mattock into the ground here to dig a hole, and I couldn't remove it. And what had happened was the mattock had gone through about 3 or 4 sheets of roofing iron, which had been dumped there and then buried by whoever smoothed this out. So under this area near Clara Street, it's actually a very difficult site because of fill. And you can see it's been filled, and there's an artificial slope here. I mean, this was going to be a freeway, remember. You can actually see very faintly in the distance there where I'm pointing at the remains of a red gum tree stump. That was the last remaining red gum stump in Brunswick. Unfortunately, it's no longer there. It was cut up for firewood, but that existed there, showing what used to be in that area. So one of the first things that had to be done was to actually work out what the planting vegetation would be, and we published in 1980 a planting guide for Merri Creek. The Pascoe Vale Naturalist Club at the time had a lot to do with that, and that's why it was launched at Coburg Lake. He's one of the... Lex Thompson was one of the main authors. This was one of the first local planting guides in Victoria, and it's had several additions. So that was good. That overcame the objection of council staff saying we don't know what to plant. Here's a book. It's got the listings in it based on botanists. The next thing was to connect up the different suburbs with the path. We decided that it was the most important thing to get public participation and engagement was to have a pathway that would connect all the suburbs. This was a challenge. There's lots of different benefits, the passive recreation and so on being a main one. And we knew then that getting out in nature is important for people. Not much nature in the inner suburbs in Melbourne, in fact, very little. It was also a way of getting council's interest, because council staff are good at making roads and paths, and so this was a way of getting them engaged in a productive way. And you can see a photograph here of Anne when she was younger. We were successful in getting a number of different grants. This particular one's a $500,000 grant. In current dollars, you know, that's quite a lot of money, which helped to put the pathway down. But the path itself, the route was constrained, and that meant that some parts of the existing path aren't in the optimum position. It was the only place that the path could actually be put in. So here's some before and after maps to show you what was happening in Brunswick. So this is the Melway map in 1976. You can see the freeway, proposed freeway there in those purple lines coming right along, cutting through Northgate Golf Course. There was going to be a big feeder offtake along Nicholson Street in East Brunswick, and the whole of the eastern side of Nichols Street, all the houses were going to be knocked down to widen the road. And Vic Roads already owned quite a lot of them in 1976. One benefit of stopping this was actually to maintain East Brunswick and the tram route, this is something we don't normally talk about, but it's actually quite significant. And the next slide shows what it's like 20 odd years later. You can see the Freeway Reservation has been removed. So that's a lot of lobbying of by the local government and the community of the state government to get the state government to revoke the freeway plan. So, you could also see that the bicycle route, if you can see this carefully, it's actually shown in there as a dotted line, and there's also bridges and other things, which I'll come to in a few moments. The revocation of the freeway originally went up to Marnie's Road, and in the late 1990s, VicRoads proposed to construct the freeway, the one that is presently built there now, from Craigieburn to the Ring Road, but they were going to go along the Merri again, and they wanted 6 bridges. So the Friends campaigned very strongly to try and change these plans, and the resulting alignment of the freeway is a result of the Friends taking VicRoads to the federal court and saying to the court, basically, they should move it, they would save lots of money, they would protect a wonderful place. And we'll show you a few photos from some of these places that have been protected. But there was a big community campaign. We had the growling grass frog going on the tram into the city a number of times to various meetings with the various politicians. Now, coming back to Brunswick as an example, but as I was saying, this is similar to many suburbs. The whole length of the Brunswick frontage has been completely changed to enable public access. So there's public access, there's a pathway along the whole route now. There's a lot more open space. It's been revegetated. The weeds have been controlled. Originally, our first walk, when we walked from the velodrome towards where Ceres now is, it was actually more than 2 metre high fennel weeds. We could only navigate by looking at the transmission line towers, the big towers, because you couldn't see anywhere else. You couldn't see more than a few metres in front of you. There's been quite a lot of little bridges put in to enable people to cross and therefore not only do exercise sort of loops, but to enable people to cross. So, for example, the bridge number 8 here, there was a lot of work done to establish that. And children from at least 6 different schools now use that bridge to go to places like Northgate High or Merri Primary and so on. And there's also been a lot more playgrounds made. But, of course, this didn't just happen by accident. There was a lot of work and campaigning. You can see here some various newspaper articles. Tom Roper was the local planning minister, and we had a big campaign to protect the Whelan site, which I'll show you in a moment. There's issues about flood walls. There was a proposal to put up a 3 metre high concrete flood wall right near the Whelan site, and so on. So many days were spent doing planning submissions. Now here's a few before and after photos. So this is taken from the Kirkdale Street Park where the Whelan's tip was, and it's looking across the creek. The creek's roughly here. You can see Anne standing there, and she's looking at the Melbourne Water. There's a works depot site. Now, all of that land in the Sumner Estate is prone to flooding, and in fact, there'd been a really big flood in 1974, which caused a lot of damage in these houses. And so Melbourne Water had proposed to build a 3 metre high concrete wall near the creek here. And we a big campaign to stop that happening, and that's what the view looks like today. The trees have been planted. There's a retarding basin that's been developed. So, for example, here's a retarding basin here in the process of being constructed. We had an earth levee put in instead of concrete walls. The levee was put as far back as possible to enable plantings, and it's designed as a retarding basin to capture flood waters, and that's really reinstating what was originally in that area, which would have been lots of billabongs, wetlands, and so on. So that's a small attempt at recreating what should be there. And here's some more photos of that area. If you're in that area walking around, you really don't know where you are. You could be anywhere in the bush in Victoria, really. It's really been a massive transformation. Now, on the Brunswick side there, this is what the Kirkdale Street Whelan's tip site used to look like. Well, it used to be a big hole in the ground, and it was slowly filled up. And in the early 80s, mid 80s, we sort of started walking through there to create the route. This is private land, remember, owned right to the centre of the creek. It abutted land where the SEC terminal station is, also owned right to the creek. And so there were two different owners here which could have prevented public access. So we had various sort of walkathon events where we'd all march through here illegally. But council had promised to purchase this as open space, but then they said they didn't have any money, and there was a big campaign then to say, well, you promised to do it, you better get on with it and make the appropriate allocations. And today it looks roughly like this. It's been restored. More or less, the plantings are trying to represent what was originally there, which should have been a big she oak woodland. And it's a great sort of picnic ground in East Brunswick. Another site that had private ownership is just north of Albion Street, where the Russian Orthodox Church is currently found. And it was owned straight right into the creek. It had been illegally filled here with concrete and so on. When the church purchased it and went through the planning process, the Friends of Merri Creek had a lot of input into council decision making here to try and get this into public ownership, which was successful. So the first public access was this fence. It's a bit ugly, but at least we had access. And then, of course, once the place was properly transferred and restored, this is how it looks. So the plantings here are the late 1990s. The church is very proud of the fact that they provided this land, but it was sort of conditional on the planning permit. But it's important to note here that the 100-year flood line, if there's a big flood come through here, the 100-year flood line is almost as high as the top of these concrete posts. So this whole area will really flood. It used to be big wetlands on both sides. The Northgate Golf Course were wetlands and billabongs, and the original creek alignment flowed through a substantial part of the Northgate Golf Course. So here's the church here. It's a big feature. It's certainly a unique building in Melbourne. So Anne's going to tell you what's happening today.
So that's a good news story, definitely. But unfortunately, it's not over yet. Immediately to the north of the church, the next property, there's a little cottage. It's a heritage protected cottage, but there's a current proposal to put in a bank of 6 3-storey townhouses. This is the view from the creek side of the property, according to the plans that are lodged with Moreland Council. These townhouses will be looking out onto the creek. There is some vegetation between those townhouses and the creek, the Merri Trail, all on public land, because this proposal doesn't have any planting on at the back of their site to screen these townhouses. So the Friends have just put in an objection to this, but it's a live proposal with council being assessed by Moreland Council. So I'd encourage anyone else out there who prizes this stretch of the creek to look at the plans. You can look at them on the Moreland Council website, and I should put in the application number, because you need that to search for the application. It's MPS, capital MPS /2020/799. I think that's right.
Anne will check that for the end of the seminar, so yes, we'll just keep going on that.
Yes, just to illustrate that there's still some challenges in restoring and protecting the creek right down in East Brunswick.
Yes, so this is on 100-year flood level will come through here. It'll flood all the first story of these buildings. So, who's going to be responsible for rescuing them? What's going on? So they're very interesting questions about how community development happens, because the developers and the real estate agents haven't been sponsors of this restoration project, but they're all making money out of it now. It's a very interesting sort of issue. Now, just talking about East Coburg, for example, so this is just immediately north of Moreland Road, and Spices Papers is a big factory here, and they own right to the creek. So again, more more work to get public access. Unfortunately, there was illegal filling and bulldozing, and the typical response from the drainage engineers is to end up with this very unnatural trapezoidal drain shape, because that's the most efficient way of moving water, if that's how you want to measure how streams should operate. And these slopes are often slippery. In other words, they're dangerous, and because they stir up all the soil, then they become weed infested. So you've got a wet, stirred up place which is steep and difficult. So some of the issues you see and face here are definitely man-made. They're industrial outcomes of different sorts of activities. This is a little bit more natural view of the site looking backwards, but a lot of work was done to plant and screen out the new development. So Friends do a lot of work, and Merri Creek Management Committee do a lot of work to talk with councils and say, well, if that's going to happen, at least screen it out. The vegetation is good for lots of things, one of which is it helps hide how ugly some of these developments are. But you can see this slope here, which is this steep slope, which gets weed infested because it's difficult to access. It's not natural and it's not helpful. Now, some things that have been done have been helpful. Here's an example further north in Thornbury. So we're looking from Thornbury across to East Coburg. Here's East Coburg here. And in this case, the Friends had saved up some money and put it towards the reinstatement of a wetland called Streddle Street Wetland. And here's the wetland here. It's in an attempt to restore or reinstate what should have been there, would have been there originally, and that involved the careful construction of the levee bank, and I can point out the levee bank for you here. And this work had just been completed when there was a really big rainfall event and the Merri Creek went into flood. And so in a sense that was fortunate, because the photo shows here the creek coming along here and then all the water flowing in over the levee bank, which had been lowered in this spot to allow water to come in. And you can find that today if you go and have a look. You can see where the water comes in, and that's a great thing. And so it was then replanted. Friends had a lot to do with this, and Merri Creek Management Committee are frequently up there as well. And so the whole area now has become a wetland, a bit of a swamp. If you go in there, you'll usually find various water birds, but there are other birds that go in there as well. It's a great spot. Lots of people find this as a very relaxing place to have a picnic or a rest or contemplate nature or life. It's blocked out East Coburg. It's in the sense it means that you feel you're in more of a bushland setting. And the Friends have done a lot of work in planting some of the ground. It's nice to put big trees in, but putting in the ground vegetation, grasses and herbs and so on. Now, getting the vegetation right is a really big thing. And the ecological restoration team at the Merri Creek Management Committee was established to help this happen in a much more professional manner and a more consistent manner and along the whole frontage of the creek. So these sorts of revegetation plans are developed, which are sort of based on the ecological vegetation classes. And I don't want to go into the details of but the different colours represent the sorts of vegetation that should be there. And then the tricky part is to get it established at the right time. So that involves careful management of weeds well before planting and then maintenance afterwards, just as you would in a home. But it's more difficult here because you have less control in many ways. So Moomba Park at Fortner, the whole thing here is to get the right plants in the right place. And in this case, I just want to illustrate two things. Along the drier rocky ridges to reinstate the right trees there, not any trees, the right sorts of trees, lightwood wattles, alocasuarinas and so on. And then, for example, along the water's edge, the reeds here are really important. So the drainage engineers were digging these out and getting rid of them, but the reeds are really important because they're the home for the reed warblers. So the reason it's the home for the reed warblers is because that's where they nest. And where birds nest, that's where their home is. So they nest here. This is their home. And if we destroy all the reed beds, that's it for them. So it's a great thing. Every time I'm down in the creek in spring, I listen for the reed warblers. Usually it's not too difficult. They spend spring and summer in Victoria, and they migrate to Queensland and so on for the winter. And so getting reeds back in is a great thing. The reed warblers tell a wonderful story.
Okay, so moving on from the revegetation work and restoration that was being done in the lower part of the Merri Creek Valley, to discoveries of really important native vegetation that remained in the middle parts of the catchment. These discoveries were made by botanists doing surveys in the 1980s and included the Central Creek grassland. Central Creek is a tributary of the Merri, and that led to a campaign again by the Friends of Merri Creek to save these grasslands. They used to cover the landscape from around the Merri Creek catchment, going west right into South Australia and the southern part of Victoria across the basalt plains. But they've been vastly modified, ploughed up, de-rocked, and the vegetation lost. So this campaign included various activities. Here's a very young Bob Brown who happened to help at a rally on the Central Creek grasslands when it was being proposed for subdivision for housing. So the subdivision plans ended up being modified. So houses were put on part of the site, but a reasonable slice of the site was retained as a reserve, and Darebin Council now manages it as Crown land, but the Merri Creek Management Committee actually looks after the grassland. And here's a recent photo showing an interpretive sign with some of the plants and the birds and animals that live in the grasslands. The kangaroos who live there are very much appreciated by the local residents, and the management involves, in fact, burning to keep the grasslands healthy quite regularly. And the management committee, ecological restoration team, cooperates with the Narrap team from the Wurundjeri people in that sort of burning and in learning about cultural burning as well as ecological burning in sites like this. It's now called Nari Jarang, the site. It's the Wurundjeri name instead of calling it Central Creek grassland. And that's part of an effort by the Friends of Merri Creek to introduce Wurundjeri place names to a number of the reserves along the creek, and Galata Tambor is a beautiful site, a rocky gorge along the creek between Campbellfield and Thomastown, further upstream from Central Creek. So again, looking at visions and looking ahead and planning, and mentioned the Merri Metro Park, we called it Metropolitan Park in early days. So we developed a plan in the year 2000 along with the Victorian National Parks Association for what we called a Merri Creek State Park, and this was running from the ring road here at the southern end northwards up the creek and its tributaries. I think we went as far as Bald Hill up past Donnybrook with the green areas, which we thought were either the waterway corridors or significant grassland and red gum woodland remnants. So that proposal, the reference here in the newspaper to a 60-year-old plan was to the Metropolitan Town Planning Commission report in 1929, which included a big park in this sort of vicinity. So here are some of these parklands. Again, the Barbie Mining, which is on Cooper Street, Campbellfield, was one of the big grassland sites identified. Took quite a campaign to protect that and not have it all subdivided for industry in this case. Part of it did end up as industrial land, but part of it has been protected as a park. And the Friends, showing a couple of Friends members there active getting rid of gorse plants, woody weed whacking, we call it. Here are some of the lovely wildflowers of the grasslands. People having a tour in spring. Onto some of the challenges we're still facing. There's still a few of them, and redevelopment, such as the example on Harrison Street I mentioned before, in the older suburbs, where the creek is now obviously a very valuable real estate asset, and people are designing buildings to bring a lot more residents overlooking the creek corridor, while we're trying to retain it as a bushland haven that doesn't look so urban. But also there's very active plans to urbanise most of the rest of the creek catchment as far as Wallen, so that brings various issues along with it. We're still trying to establish this park along the whole length of the Merri Creek, and current work is being done in the state government to plan for the Upper Merri parklands. That's a work in progress. Managing the conservation areas is an ongoing challenge too, because of lack of resources to actively manage some of those grasslands. We want to widen the corridor. It's a very narrow corridor. I'm sure you've all appreciate that, particularly in lockdown times when it's so popular and a lot of people are crowding onto the path, but also where it's not wide enough to screen out the adjoining structures. We're still talking about environmentally appropriate flood control, because wetlands, the natural wetlands, are really important in retaining stormwater runoff. But the planning authority in the upper catchment doesn't seem to recognise this, and is quite happy to build over the natural wetland depressions. Water quality is an ongoing problem. All the drains in the catchment flow into the Merri Creek, and most of them have no treatment, so anything that runs off our streets or industrial sites goes straight into the creek. And resources to continue the work of restoration, which obviously does need to continue. And one of the biggest threats, challenges, is of course the impacts of climate change. So urban growth, do we want our catchment to look like this, which is an example on the left of a recent suburb in the upper or middle Merri catchment? Very little vegetation, very little space for vegetation, or more sensitive, in fact, biodiversity sensitive urban design, such as proposed by a group at RMIT University. These plans, as I said, this is the existing urban areas in red, but the plans for urban growth go as far as Wallen. And the Friends of Merri Creek and the Merri Creek Management Committee had a plan for a habitat corridor network and conservation areas in green, but in fact the plans have not, so part of those green areas have been protected in the plans for the Northern Growth Corridor, but part of them haven't. And the urban growth brings threats obviously to the native grasslands when they're cleared and built on, to those wetlands, as I've mentioned. There's threats of increased flooding downstream as surfaces are paved. Water quality, particularly with our soils in this catchment that disperse very readily when they're disturbed, when the surface protection is disturbed, and we end up with a coffee-coloured creek down in the lower reaches, and we're losing habitat for wildlife through suburbs that blanket the landscape. So these are some of the lovely old red gums, hundreds of years old, that we're trying to protect in the face of urban growth. Here's another example of the Friends as part of a broader protest on the loss of our green wedges around Melbourne. The growling grass frog and the fat-tailed dunnart came out on that protest. The water quality issues, you'd all be well aware of the sorts of rubbish that you can see, the litter and so on that get washed down the creek, but it's also the invisible pollutants in the creek that really badly affect the aquatic life. And climate change, here's a burnt area up on the middle of the catchment along the creek, and we're likely to get more fires, obviously. So comparing the original way we planted, not very successful with the plantings today, a big community group planting under the supervision of the Merri Creek Management Committee, and matting put down to stop weed growth. But all this sort of thing, doing it properly with the right plants in the right place, costs money, and it needs follow-up management and maintenance. So we need to keep the resources flowing in to continue the work. And obviously, community engagement's always been really important to the transformation of the Merri Creek, and it's something that we want to continue very much. And the Merri Creek Management Committee does a lot of this work. There's a school group here discussing the creek and its values and issues, and bush kinders. Merri Park's a really popular place for bush kinders and nature play areas. So that's just the two examples of people enjoying the restoration that's gone on in the creek. Now, just to summarise, we think that there's two primary achievements of the efforts of so many people and agencies, local governments particularly, that have gone into the last 45 years. One is transforming the lower Merri, which was quite degraded, and also the second one is protecting the natural areas that remained in the middle and upper catchments. And these achievements came about through the shared vision that I outlined earlier, shared between lots of community members and agencies, government agencies, and constructive and creative approaches. When we struck obstacles, it was better not to just say, no, 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 stop this, don't do that. It's much better to have a constructive alternative as a proposal and think outside the box, think of good ways to get around an obstacle or overcome a challenge. Collaborations obviously have been essential, collaborations between lots of groups and individuals and government agencies. And persistence is a key ingredient in this sort of thing. You just have to keep going. You have setbacks, but you have victories and achievements, and you can certainly see the rewards for persistent activity. So we've covered a few of the current and future challenges. As I said, it's still, the journey is continuing and there's lots more to be done. So I'd encourage everyone to get involved in either by joining Friends of Merri Creek or one of the local groups that are active along the creek, or supporting the Merri Creek Environment Fund with donations, or just generally advocating for this to councils or state government for some of the things we've been talking about today. Finally, we'll leave you with our vision of the creek, which is about parklands being protected and revegetated, having clean water, something we're still working on, good habitat for wildlife, and a valued community asset. So that's all from me.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Bruce. And I'm sure if we turned on everyone's microphones, there'd be resounding applause for the two of you. Before we get into specific questions, there's lots and lots of people saying thank you for your amazing work. You may have seen the comments in chat, but don't get too distracted by them at the moment. But people have described you as warriors, legit heroes, that it's staggeringly visionary stuff, that they're so grateful that you are amazing local treasures, and that this is so interesting. And those were the ones early on. There are many more coming up now, just acknowledging that we wouldn't have this beautiful creek if it weren't for you and your early vision and the other people who were working with you. People have been amazed to understand the changes, perhaps people more newly coming to the creek, saying to think that one of my most precious sacred places was almost a highway. Unreal. So thank you, everyone. You're putting in some really terrific words of appreciation, and that means a lot to everyone. Now, there are quite a lot of specific questions, and they're coming up quickly. But one of the questions was, did you have any advice for other groups who are trying to restore other waterways? And I think actually towards the end of your presentation, you certainly identified some of the ingredients that were needed in terms of collaboration and grit and persistence and having a vision, and presenting alternatives. Is there anything you want to add to that advice?
That's a good question, and we have actually given talks to groups about that, our experience. I mean, there's different ways of viewing this, and some of the activities we did and campaigns we ran. It's certainly, if there are local groups on other creeks, we're happy to talk with them about it using a different set of sort of presentations, I suppose. But I think it is important to be collaborative. Most councils these days now are much more professional than they used to be. I'm not trying to say that in a negative sense. The councils are bigger, they have more staff. It is accepted that environmental issues are important. So usually there's quite a lot of sympathetic people now in local councils, and so it's not so much a matter of having to try and get their attention, but how to work with them to get these things accepted. So the planning components are important and the budgeting issues are important. In a sense, it's about how you use the skills you have in our group. And going back to the 80s, we had a whole lot of different people who were contributing, people who were taxi drivers, school teachers, unemployed, draftsmen. In fact, a draftsman is one of our biggest heroes, because he was able to demonstrate that the proposed levee banks and concrete walls weren't going to do the job, and that was really powerful. And we've been very fortunate with Anne, because she did planning, urban and regional planning, and so she's put those skills to great benefit, really. We're very fortunate about that. So groups, if they've got people who have planning knowledge and skills, that's really good to get them involved, because they understand the jargon and the legislation, or how to talk the lingo to the council. So there's lots of components here. It is complex, and it does take persistence. It does take persistence. Councils will have 3-year rolling cycles. So even if they say today, yeah, that's a great idea, you might not get on the, it's basically playing in a team sport. You're not going to necessarily get on the field straight away. You've got to get, through 3 or 4 years perhaps, and that can be frustrating. But it's about starting, and you never know your luck. Sometimes you do get on the field.
Thanks, Bruce. We've got someone who said all of this needs to be put into a book, and that perhaps we collectively need to write a book on this. That's a terrific suggestion, sure. And I hope one day we see a book. Oh, someone else has said I agree, or even a film. So there we go.
There's been some attempts at that. So some of the resources are up on them, as you know, Louise. It's on the Merri Creek Management Committee has an archive, so there are publications and things there. We certainly in the past made sure the local libraries had the books. So certainly Coburg Library had a good collection of Merri Creek things. I'm not sure what it's like today. Yeah, we are writing things about it, and there's a fair bit of work. I think Anne's so busy still as a volunteer that there's not as much time, perhaps. But, yeah, we understand that, and that's partly a reason to give talks so that people do hear it.
And to record the talks. So thank you for that. Now, a particular question is about where did you, or how did you source the original Indigenous plants, given that so much of at least the lower Merri had been done over?
So the actual sourcing, rather than finding out the species, I guess is the question, isn't it? Sourcing the plant material.
I think so, yes. Well,
there's two. One, I mentioned Lex Thompson earlier. Lex actually was doing forestry, and so he had a good botanical knowledge, and his family were all interested in native plants, so they'd been looking at that. The Society for Growing Australian Plants, which is now called
Australian
Australian Plant Society, they were working on aspects of this. So there was in Melbourne broadly increasing knowledge, but yeah, people did walk up and down the creek, and there are a number of places, and I won't name them particularly because they're still sensitive, but there are a number of places in the Lower Merri that did have small patches of remnant native veg, so you could go along there and say, I can see a Wallenberger, I can see kangaroo grass, I know they're here. Even in Brunswick,
but
there
you could
was
also collect seeds. That's where
yes,
the source of the material.
Yeah, and then further up. So I mean, even in Brunswick, there was a few blackwood trees, there was a few red gum trees, small saplings growing. So you can say, well, it's got to be a local plant, But as you went further up the creek, then there was more and more. So Galard Tambor, there was quite a lot of plants there which were used, and for example, rock corriers were there. People took cuttings. I remember growing a rock corrier in our front garden from Galard Tambor as someone had collected a cutting, and then that was used a number of times to take a lot more cuttings. I think several hundred plants went out, but people understood that you had to try and diversify the genetic sources of that, and it's more sophisticated today.
But very important development was the establishment of the Victorian Indigenous Nurseries Cooperative, which started, did it start a series?
No, it started. Well, George Smith was a teacher at Moreland High School, and which no longer exists. And George was a member of the Merri Creek Coordinating Committee, and George thought that was a tech school, wasn't it? And Moreland Tech, and so he knew that was a good thing for his students to hands on, and they set it up in what used to be the car park, and then it moved to Ceres, and then it moved to Yarra Bend Park. Yeah.
So they propagated an enormous number of plants, and they still do, for the revegetation along the Merri Creek.
Yep.
Thank you for that answer. Now we have an important question. Is there anything that we can do? The questioner is asking to apply pressure to have the Upper Merri parklands declared as protected.
You could probably answer that as well as we could, Louisa. Is it in hand or is it not?
Well, look, maybe I'll have a brief go at answering this. It might not seem like it, but there is some progress happening. Merri Creek Management Committee is on a partnership group that's been established with state government departments and authorities and the local governments, relevant ones, and there is progress being made. But I think that probably Anne and Bruce were slightly outside of that process in the formal way, can probably, from a Friends of Merri Creek perspective, can probably say a bit more about whether we need pressure at this point and how you might exert that pressure.
Well, one of the issues is where those parklands, where the boundaries are going to be drawn, and is it just existing public land and land that's been designated as conservation areas in the planning for that northern growth corridor, or whether there are gaps or pinch points or links to other significant sites that we need to add to the park. That's one issue that we need to think about very carefully in the next little while. The other issue, of course, is resources to actually establish and manage the parklands when they're designated. It's all very well drawing lines on maps, but it costs money to manage ecological restoration and even natural ecosystems. They need management. The Wurundjeri Woiwurrung were managing these landscapes for thousands of years, and we can't just lock them up and walk away. So I'd say stay tuned to the Friends of Merri Creek website, Facebook page and newsletter for opportunities when we want and need people to, and Instagram, when we need people to be writing letters or speaking to your local MP or whatever on these matters. So probably not immediately, but it could well happen in the next few months. You're muted, Louisa.
I'm very sorry about that. Thank you, Anne. We've had a number of questions around the issue of water quality and litter traps. One person has asked about, are there practical ways to improve the water quality, and looking forward to the idea of swimming happening in the Merri. And I'd just like to acknowledge one of our attendees has a long memory of Merri Creek, going way back to those of you that know the Harding Street Bridge across Merri Creek, that there was a sandy beach there, and kids did play and swim in that big swimming hole there. It's a wonderful vision.
I'm not sure who that might be, but I can tell you that a former mayor has told me that when she was a girl that she swam.
Yes, it's that former mayor.
And I always tell that story because if you walk across that Harding Street Bridge and look down, it's not a lovely sandy bank. And people say, well, how would you know it's a nice sandy bank? And it's because on the opposite side of the Merri at that point, so in West Preston there is actually, it's not basalt soils, it's actually Silurian sandstone. And so the creek has washed the sand from the sandstone and deposited it just slightly, downstream. And that's why there would have been a nice sandy bank. So look, water quality is a complicated issue. In terms of litter, the Merri Creek Coordinating Committee actually instigated a litter study in 1985, and I think that was the first one in Australia. I'm happy to be corrected, but it's certainly a very early litter study. At the time, Melbourne Water didn't want to be part of it, but the Environmental Protection Authority did, and so trials were run with the support of Coburg Council on the lake, on Coburg Lake, at various types of litter traps. And there were several others trialled in the early years of the Merri Creek Management Committee existence. So there's several sites you can look at, but it's become more sophisticated, and I think Melbourne University has been engaged in aspects of this now with Melbourne Water to look at litter control. But of course, it's the source, it's the issue, trying to stop litter going into streets and drains. So council drains, a lot of council drains, they can block up, especially if there's heavy rain. So, anyone who litters in the street or washes their car in the street, all that goes down the drain. But it's even natural rainfall brings in nutrients, and there's thousands of tonnes of nutrients actually hit the roads, and because it now rushes off quickly into the waterways, then that's, as Anne highlighted before, and we're talking about Strudel Street wetland, there actually needs to be what you might call filter beds established everywhere. That's why you need a wider corridor along the creek. You need spaces where basically reinstating the functions of natural wetlands to slow the water down and to let nature remove some of the nutrients for you, and that's really the key to this. But yeah, there's plenty of other issues.
Thanks, Bruce. And I think we know it's been a long haul already, the 45 years, and especially addressing water quality. Unfortunately, there's not a quick fix, but there is a lot that can be done, and there are things that are slowly being done. So I think a big thank you to councils that have been building those filter beds, installing wetlands. We're looking forward to a fabulous new wetland on Merri Creek up in Moomba Park, Fawkner, and the recent wetland constructed in Jones Park, just across from the Russian Orthodox Church. We need lots more. I have a vision of a wetland every 200 metres along the creek. It might be there long after I've gone, but it's a vast scale, but incrementally. When you look at the landscape change that has occurred in the time that Anne and Bruce have been involved with Merri Creek, we need that long-term vision. I can just see someone has asked about any reports on substances dissolved in Merri Creek water and what are the concerns. I'd better stop talking because my background is at freshwater ecology, and I could spend far too much time on that. But yeah, there is quite a bit of information about water quality, dissolved pollutants and toxicants in Merri Creek water. And yes, there are matters of really high level of concern of heavy metals, hydrocarbons and other substances. And Charles, who's asking the question, please get in touch with me via admin@mcmc.org.au, and I can direct you to the reports if you want to get into it in that level of detail. We've had a few other questions. There's a comment. Someone's commented that how much they love the parklands and love visiting, but think that the lack of toilets in a number of areas is an issue. I'm extrapolating on the comment that was made, but I know that can act as a barrier to people spending any extended amounts of time in the parklands, and wanted to know whether councils are looking at that. I know we've got some people from our local councils at this seminar, but I won't unmute you. But the provision of toilets has slowly been improving, but it's very inequitable in my view. Sorry, I'm supposed to be letting you answer the question, but we're reasonably well provided in around East Brunswick and Lower Northgate, and it gets harder and harder as you go further north.
But that is a very good topic to discuss at the Merri Creek Management Committee meetings, Louisa. Perhaps we should put it on the agenda in the future.
Yeah, these things have come up over many years, and the one that goes with it, of course, is things like bubble taps. Having a drinking stop. So if you go for a long bike ride, can you stop somewhere or whatever? And it is difficult and challenging for councils. I'm not an apologist for councils, but I understand their reasons because it's very expensive. And so you get the difficulty is you say, well, if we're going to spend, let's say, $100,000 on restoration and so on, what's the best way to spend it? And the trouble is the toilets, installing them and connecting them to the sewer is actually quite expensive. But I think it's a legitimate question. There are a lot more toilets that are associated with sports clubs, which are often locked up during the week. And so then you get the question of, well, who maintains them? And you've got the vandals going around causing all of us problems. So it's the vandal. If none of these toilets were vandalised, then I don't think it'd be a problem. I think there'd be a lot more open. And so it's this complex social issue about protecting public assets. And I suppose the broader issue is, and this is what's happening, is the more people who are around using it, the less likely you are to have dumb things happening like illegal rubbish dumping, vandalising toilets, and in fact riding trail bikes. A lot of people used to ride trail bikes here in the late 70s, early 80s. You don't see them very often today. So there's a sort of a fine line here between, you want enough people using it to get these facilities established and protected. You don't want too many because then you think you're in Burke Street.
Thanks, Bruce. We've had a couple of questions about particular sites. I mean, someone just acknowledged the wonderful transformation at the Strettle wetlands, and someone else has asked, what do you see as the future for the Northgate Golf Course?
I'd refer you there to a statement that the Friends of Merri Creek have drawn up, a statement of principles, really. We're not saying it should be this or it should be or one thing or the other, but we're saying consider these matters when deciding on future land use on the golf course. And that statement's on the Friends of Merri Creek website. You just need to Google Friends of Merri Creek.
Yes, it's an interesting thing that the original alignment of the Merri Creek was that it flowed south of Moreland Road only for 40 or 50 metres at the most, and then did a big S-bend. So it went back across. It wasn't called Moreland Road then. because the road didn't exist, because the creek flowed back north and then did a big S-bend and came back down again. So there's a big S-bend. And so to construct Moreland and Normanby roads in the late 40s and early 1950s, they actually straightened the creek from what is now Moreland Road to roughly Brunswick Velodrome. That's a straight artificial channel. And the original alignment of the creek did a big S-bend.
Out as far as the golf course club rooms.
Yes, over there, that was sort of on where the club rooms are now is roughly on a sort of a rocky cliff, and it's been filled in with rubbish. And originally, apparently, there used to be some of the best water holes on the Merri Creek used to be along there, probably good swimming holes too for that earlier inquiry. But they're all been filled up now. It's probably unlikely they're going to reinstate that alignment, but all of that area that we're talking about, there's about, I can't remember, is it 9 hectares or something, would have all been wetlands. That would have been a floodplain and would have been natural wetlands and so on there over several of the fairways. So I think it's fair to say over the years that the way the Merri Creek developments happen is that we've never said at any time that we're against any active sport. It's been about how to get better access for the public and, you know, passive type recreation going. And so it hasn't been a good idea to say you're against the Brunswick Cycling Club. We had to get past the Brunswick Cycling Club. None of us were against cycling. Sometimes the sports clubs might have been a bit possessive about sort of a use right that they might have had, but it's always been much better to work with groups, and there's plenty of win-wins. I think Brunswick Velodrome and Cycling Club now is a major beneficiary of the fact that there's a shared path along there. They didn't do anything to construct that. They weren't interested in that at all, certainly not in the 70s or 80s, but they're a major access point now for all the kids on the weekend who go there. So that's a great win. You know, most of us are really happy about that.
Thanks, and I think we've just posted in the chat a link to the Friends of Merri Creek's position on Northgate Golf Course. I'm aware that it's almost time to finish up, but I was also supposed to invite my colleague Michael Longmore to bring any questions that he might have received to our attention. Michael, did you get any questions through via email?
No, nothing's come through via email, so
okay.
Yeah, we're all good there.
Thank you. Look, there's been a really interesting comment about the Harding Street Bridge and the fact that the existing bridge was sympathetically designed with the an earlier bridge in mind, and voicing concerns about a new bridge that is proposed for that site, and the fact that in the view of Gary Vines, who's making the comment, and I know has a particular interest and knowledge in heritage matters, that the proposed replacement is an over-engineered and unsympathetic intrusion, and is the Friends of Merri Creek making a submission on this?
That's a very good question, Gary. We haven't made a submission so far, but we would welcome your assistance in writing one about that. Please get in touch with us. You can do that via the website, because yes, I agree. I've glimpsed the plans, and they are certainly nothing like the current suspension bridge. And in slightly different alignment too. So we need to look at that very carefully.
That's right. It's interesting because the current bridge was established 1985, opened. I think it replaced a bridge that had been about 50 years old, and it's back in the mid 80s. The councils had decided not to replace the old suspension bridge, and the Merri Creek Coordinating Committee, one of their big achievements was actually to raise a small amount of money to put towards the bridge and effectively bring the two councils to their senses. So both Preston and then Coburg councils was sort of jolted into coming into the party, so to speak. So I think there's a blast plaque to that effect up there. So that was a big community benefit to reinstate that bridge, which, as Gary said, is roughly the same type of style suspension bridge. But it's a bit tricky because, the Merri path's been a shared pathway. It's not a cycle path. It wasn't established by anyone to be a cycle commuter route, and it's never been supported by VicRoads. Remember, VicRoads wanted a freeway. So it's an interesting development, and it's a bit of a challenge to everyone that the pressure to provide a main cycling route down the Merri has never been the objective, and it's not something that could be safely done either. It was designed in 1982, International Year of Disability, for anybody to use it, people in prams, wheelchairs, rollerblades, you name it. It's not a cycling commuter route. So if they think by establishing a very large freeway-style bridge there is a solution, it's actually a challenge to the sorts of things we've been talking about. So how do you get the right balance here is the real question.
Thanks, Bruce. There are a couple of other questions. We're past the time only a few minutes past the time we said we'd end up, but do you want to
happy to do a couple more questions.
Answer a couple more, and thank you for those who are staying, and obviously some people have left, but we're so grateful that so many people have been attending this webinar. There is a question about whether there's any artificial flow in Merri Creek. I'm not exactly sure in this context what is meant by artificial flow. I might jump in here and say there is some discharge, or there has been in the past discharge from upstream sewage treatment plants. I'm actually not sure of what the status of that is now, because there's been a lot of upgrades to the sewer system and connections to the main metropolitan sewerage system, which greatly diminished that. Treated sewage as a small component of what turns up in Merri Creek. Some people may be aware that when there are very high flows, the sewerage system comes under a lot of pressure, and there are emergency relief valves along parts of Merri Creek, and when those relief valves open, yes, untreated sewage can enter Merri Creek. A lot of recent upgrade works are intended to greatly diminish the frequency with which that happens. I'm not sure if that's the question about artificial, if that answers the question about artificial flow.
You could argue that most of the flow is now artificial. I mean, the water's coming in off drains and streets, which are all artificial. So it's a question of whether you're trying to wear a real purist hat on that, or whether you're trying to say, well, but the flow, certainly the peak flows after heavier rainfall events, that's artificial, and it's causing problems. And the government understands that, and there is a group in Melbourne Water that's doing a lot of work on sort of more sustainable stream management, and they've got some very good reports on what they think could happen. So there are allies in that part of Melbourne Water, but the challenges really are the new planning for new suburbs and how they're constructed.
I think perhaps there is a question someone's asked, can we watch the recording at a later date? And yes, you can, and I'm just typing in a reply about that, but we'll be uploading it to the MSIMSI YouTube channel, and we'll notify all attendees when that's available. There was perhaps a final question. Someone wanted to know about biodiversity surveys, whether there have been any any done recently along Merri Creek to quantify the natural assets?
That's a question for you too, Louisa. I could just chip in that the Friends have been running bird surveys, so one aspect of biodiversity, at 10 different sites along the creek since late 2008. So there's quite a good record database of bird records, but other a comprehensive biodiversity survey, I think the answer is no. But Louisa, you might be able to.
I think I'm going to perhaps pass over to Michael. I think the critical thing you've noted there is comprehensive. I think what we've been seeing is surveys for particular purposes or being undertaken by a particular council. A lot of work was done, I guess, in the last decade for the upper parts of Merri Creek, but because of the expansion of the urban growth boundary, but there weren't necessarily simultaneous surveys, well, there weren't simultaneous surveys downstream, so it's somewhat ad hoc. Michael, would you like to comment?
Yeah, there's certainly nothing systematic throughout the catchment, and there was quite a lot of surveying work done a decade or so ago as part of that Melbourne urban growth expansion process. I know that Hume Council have recently, in the last couple of years, had fairly systematic surveys through council conservation areas along the Merri Creek and elsewhere in the city of Hume. I'm not aware of other councils doing anything to the same degree in recent years, but certainly there have been many different studies over the years, but as you say, they're always separated council to council, nothing across the board. And I guess there's a lot of citizen science data that's coming in, particularly these days with through applications like iNaturalist and so forth, but again, it's incidental sort of observations that people see, nothing comprehensive.
Thanks, Michael. And look, I think we've got lots of people leaving, lots of people saying thank you. I think it's probably time to end this webinar and to thank you and Bruce so much for a fabulous presentation.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for having us, Louisa.
And to thank Michael for his assistance in some of the technical sides of this. Lots and lots of other thank yous coming in.